Alrighty, folks, it is April of 2025, and here we are at long last, episode 100 of the Summit Up podcast. Air horns in the background, producer Dustin, various effects on the screen, applause, hooray! 100 episodes, everybody. We finally did it. And in addition to 100 episodes, we recently crossed 40,000 YouTube subscribers. When we first started this podcast in October of 2022, we had like around 1,600 subscribers. So that's a increase of more than 2,300% of subscribers since we have started the podcast. And as of April of 2025, people have spent more than 108,000 hours watching the show on YouTube alone. That's not even including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the audio downloads and stuff. 108,000 hours is roughly 12 years of total time watching us talk about CMMC and adjacent topics. And we just wanted to say thanks. We're extremely appreciative of everybody who's spent any amount of time watching the show, anybody who's ever liked or subscribed. Thanks to Summit 7 for letting us do this now every week. Originally was just a monthly show. And, we've been down a lot of rabbit holes over the years, over the episodes. We've done everything from deep dives into obscure DoD strategy documents to reinforce why CMMC was a thing, even when DoD wasn't really talking about it. We've talked about the inner workings of rulemaking, which no one actually knows how it works, but turns out is the signal in the noise to figure out what's going on in terms of cybersecurity regulations in this space. We've talked about the changes in legal philosophy of Supreme Court decisions, because people will, latch onto any kind of news to convince themselves that CMMC isn't happening or shouldn't happen. We've talked to lawyers. We've talked to security experts. We've talked to all kinds of folks on the show, and we've dived into the minute details of NIST cybersecurity controls, how they're revised, how they're tailored. We've spent hours and hours talking to the great and powerful Ron Ross and everything in between. And now, today, at episode 100, we're starting over. We're starting over at the basics. We're starting over with the evergreen, vanilla 101 topics. We're going to talk about the suite of cybersecurity clauses in the DFARS. So if you're new here, if you're just hearing about CMMC, if you're watching this afterwards, this is square zero, essentially, of where to start to understand this big, humongous saga of CMMC overall.
The theme of this week, obviously, is a tradition unlike any other, right? Today, as this show airs, we are kicking off the Masters tournament, which both of us are interested in. Also a tradition like any other. Every Thursday, Summit Up comes. And then finally, in this episode, another tradition unlike any other is clauses in federal contracts, especially in the DoD, that mandate cybersecurity regulations. It's just the perfect trio, and it's the best way to kick off episode 100. Thank you, everybody, for liking and subscribing. Thank you, Summit 7, for giving us the platform. Now let's have some fun.
Yeah, there's nothing more exciting. Nothing gets people out of bed in the morning more than golf and cybersecurity regulations. Two absolutely gripping topics. But yeah, okay, so let's get started here. So what I call the DFARS Cyber Series of regulations is a set of 5 solicitation provisions and contract clauses that govern cybersecurity requirements for defense contractors handling controlled unclassified information. This set of 5 things is the text of all the regulatory requirements that eventually triggers you having to implement NIST cybersecurity controls, eventually having to go through external third-party assessments to prove that you've implemented them. It defines which cloud enclaves you're allowed to use or not, because the DoD has certain requirements on their ability to access it if something goes wrong. Everything revolves around the text of these solicitations and clauses in the DFARS Cyber Series. Eventually, CMMC is going to add 2 more, and we'll have a total of, drum roll, everybody, we'll have a total of 7 items. You couldn't have drawn it up any better. We'll have
We
a total
didn't influence that.
We did not influence this. You'll have a total of 7 items in the DFARS Cyber Series. That's
It's
a lot
like
of things
Russian
to know.
nesting dolls of clauses too, is the
Oh,
way
yeah.
that it works out. It's like,
Oh,
oh,
yeah.
go to this bigger clause that says kind of the same thing.
Yeah,
It's
they definitely cross-reference each other quite a bit. And that's a lot of stuff to keep up with. So we're going to do an episode for each one of them and sort of have these first few episodes, starting with episode 100. We'll be able to refer back to them forever, essentially, and build off of it as we go down another set of 100 rabbit holes in the future. So the current set of 5 items are DFARS 252.204-7008, 7009, 7012, 7019, and 7020. So we'll dive into each of these, but that's the current set. Eventually, when CMMC comes around, it will add 2 more items to this list: DFARS 252.204-7021, which some people may be familiar with, and a TBD numbered 252.204-70 something something solicitation provision. We won't know what that number is until the final rule comes out. So there'll be this total set of 7 items. But now that we've covered the layout of the suite of cybersecurity clauses here, the first one on the list is the shortest. It's just 309 words, but it's easily the most impactful one, because DFARS 7008 is the one that puts you on the hook for everything else. By accepting the terms outlined in DFARS 7008, you are attesting to the government that you will comply with DFARS 7012. DFARS 7012 is usually the one that everybody talks about. It's really the center of gravity for everything else, but technically DFARS 7008 comes prior to 7012 for the sole purpose of making you aware that 7012 exists. They say it twice, which feels redundant, but as we'll talk about in a little bit, they added this solicitation provision to be like, hey, hello, just so you're aware, your contract will have DFARS 7012 in it. And by accepting and bidding on this solicitation, you are telling us that you will comply with that contract clause. You're good, right? Everybody's good, right? That's what 7008 ultimately is doing. And that starts the cascade of implementing NIST cybersecurity controls and eventually full-blown third-party CMMC assessment. It all begins with 7008.
And so is 7008 one of those ones that maybe spot off? I might see it in an occasional solicitation, Jacob, or is it one of those ones that kind of is just everywhere, right? We're just throwing it everywhere.
Yeah. Technically, you should see it everywhere. And we'll talk about specifically why that's true in a little bit. But just like the big brother DFARS 7012, this is supposed to go in all solicitations and contracts by default. And then it's up to you if you want to negotiate it out. So let's just talk about how we got to 7008. So 7008 was created via a final rule in 2016. So if you actually look at DFARS 7008 at the very top, in parentheses after the title, it says October of 2016, because that's when it was created via the final rule. So just as a brief recap, contract clauses are one part. They're just one part of the set of federal acquisition regulations contained in the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. They're also just one part of any agency supplements to the FAR. The DoD, DHS, Department of Interior, they all buy stuff. And so they have supplements to the regulations that go with any federal agency that has to buy stuff. In the DoD space, we call that the DFARS. It's the Defense Supplement to the FAR. And so since contract clauses are part of the overall FAR, and that is a regulation, and since regulations are created through a process called rulemaking, contract clauses and solicitation provisions, therefore, must also go through the rulemaking process. Now, that might seem kind of boring, but this matters. This matters because if you only ever read the text of the contract clause, the text of the regulation, the one small part that you see, you only see what it says. If you want to know why it is that way, if you want to know how it came to be in that current form, which most people, honestly, when they first find out they have these obligations, it's the first question they ask is, why am I doing this? Not how do I do this? Then you have to go to the published rules from the rulemaking process. And that is the only place that you'll be able to see the government's rationale for why they're doing what they're doing, why they did what they did, and therefore how you can predict what they're going to do in the future, which has really been the basis for this whole show for 100 episodes. So, for example, in the rule that was published that created DFARS 7008 in its current final form, there are public comments about cost impacts to small business. And there are a bunch of people who submit public comments that request clarification on why is 7008 and 7012, why are they two separate things? They basically say the same thing. Why do we have two separate things? And they repeat themselves. The DoD here repeats themselves multiple times in the rule. And they say the addition of a new provision, 252204, 7008, ensures that the offerer is aware of the requirements in clause 252.204.7012 and has time to bring their system into compliance and negotiate the terms of the contract accordingly. They say this multiple times in response to public comments in 2016. 7008 is the red flag that says these are going to be your requirements for your system handling our DoD data. And if you can't do it, or you don't want to do it, or you want to negotiate, you need to do that now. You need to do that now, not after, and especially not way after once the CMMC assessors show up to verify that you have complied with the thing that you were supposed to negotiate. So that's what DFARS 7008 is doing fundamentally. They sort of say this in another way later on in the rule. They say DFARS provision 252.204 7008 serves as a notice to offerers. The provision puts the offerer on notice that when performance of the contract requires covered defense information, another term for controlled and classified information that you receive from the DoD, when it involves that information on a covered contractor information system, that's your information system processing their data, the security requirements in NIST SP 800-171 apply and must be implemented no later than December 31st, 2017. Why do they say that? Why in the clause do they say December 31st, 2017? That was almost 10 years ago at this point. It's because at the time the rule was written, it was October of 2016. And they said you have over a year to get ready. And the deadline for implementation is 2017. That's why today, when there's debates about CMMC and whether it's worth it, the DoD will be like, we told you guys almost a decade ago that the deadline to meet these requirements was the end of 2017. And that if you had a problem, this notice was telling you to negotiate with us in the terms of the deal, essentially. So that's at a high level what 7008 is doing before we even ever read the details of the provision.
It's so crazy to think about how history repeats itself. Like if you look at present state right now, where do you see similarities of 7008, 7021, right? It's the announcement of this is what's about to happen. And then we're waiting on 70XX, as you have named it earlier in the show, to dictate exactly what comes after that and when it needs to be done by. And obviously that'll kind of fall within that rollout of the CMMC program.
Yeah, and a little bit of a preview here. The overall structure of this DFARS cyber suite of solicitations and provisions and clauses, they complement each other. So 7008 makes you aware of 7012. 7019 makes you aware of 7020. 70XX, whatever that number is going to be, makes you aware of 7021. And so they aren't seven separate things. DFARS 7009 is a little bit of a separate story. We'll cover that in a different episode. But that's generally the structure. Solicitation provision, contract clause. Solicitation provision, contract clause. Here, 7008 is the provision that makes you aware, as they say, of the contract clause DFARS 7012. So what does it say? What does DFARS 7008 say? It's only 309 words. And at the very top, they say, as prescribed in 204.7304, use the following provision. What is that? What? first of all, we're already talking about 252.204.7008, this weird addressing that we use in the structure of the FAR and the DFARS. Now, before we even get into the text, they're pointing us somewhere else, right? So what is 204.7304? Here's the main concept. The FAR and the DFARS are way more than just the text of your contract clauses and your solicitation and provisions. Most of the FAR and the DFARS are not for you. They are instructions to contract officers. They are a set of instructions and regulations and requirements for the contract workforce when they are buying stuff. You only interact with a very small fraction of that, which is the text of the clauses and provisions that show up in your paperwork. Everything else is for the contract workforce. So the clauses that you see are only a tiny fraction of the overall regulation. And so when we say 252.204.7008, we're talking about part 252, which is the text of solicitations and clauses. I'll show it up on the screen that we'll edit in post, right? The other major part that affects contractors in this conversation is part 204, which is administrative and information matters. So if you click on part 204 and you go to 7304, these are instructions to contract officers regarding this specific solicitation provision that is going to you. And it says that in this part of 7008, use the provision at 252.204.7008, known as compliance with safeguarding covered defense information controls, in all solicitations, including solicitations using FAR Part 12 procedures for the acquisition of commercial products and commercial services, except for solicitations solely for the acquisition of commercially available off-the-shelf COTS items. So this is to your point that you mentioned earlier. Does this go everywhere? Am I going to see this everywhere? Is this like a occasional thing that shows up? The instructions to the contract workforce say, put DFARS 7008 in all solicitations anytime there is a chance that they are going to be dealing with covered defense information. That goes in solicitations below the acquisition threshold. It goes in there for commercial items. The only exception is that it doesn't go in for COTS products. Otherwise, it's going to get shotgunned out into basically every DoD solicitation that hits the street.
All right, so I'm going to need you to help me out here. Okay, I want to make sure that I'm tracking with what you're putting down so that everybody else can track, right? Essentially, when a certain contract comes up and that contract meets these specific parameters, it pertains to this kind of information. In this case, there would be instructions for the solicitation that these things have to be put in there unless that contract pertains to COTS items, right?
That's right.
Yep. So no matter what, every contract's going to get this if they meet that specific criteria.
That's right.
It's not like we can willy-nilly be like, you know what, I don't feel like 7008 today, or I don't feel like 7012 or 7012 today.
Yep. It's not a feeling. Yep. It goes in by default. Technically, we could go one layer deeper, but it's maybe a little too in the weeds.
The term I was looking for is circumstantial. Only circumstance in which it's exempt is when it's COTS.
Yeah, exactly. The only time you're getting out of it is if they know for sure that there will be no covered defense information involved whatsoever, or it's a COTS acquisition. If it's not one of those two situations, it's going in the solicitation. And as we have found out over the years, their ability to tell when there will be covered defense information or not, they always defer to saying you will end up dealing with covered defense information. So they put it in by default, and then it's up to you to negotiate it out, as they have said. And if you don't negotiate it out, it's stuck in your contracts, and that causes a lot of problems later on down the road because they decided to insert it by default, which is what they're told to do. It's what the regulation tells them to do.
So you threw out a term there that's kind of like a hazy term to people, covered defense information, right? Like, so did they just throw that in there and everybody's just got to guess to what it is, or did they?
Well, so technically, if we were to go one layer deeper, maybe a little beyond the scope of this conversation, there is another set of instructions for contract officers known as the PGI, Guidance and Instructions. And they say that the contract officer will be notified by the DoD requiring activity, the command, the program, or whatever, that the acquisition will involve covered defense information. And then when they're told that it will involve covered defense information, they go to the instructions and they say, use this provision in these solicitations. Now, does that happen exactly as it's written in the depths of the PGI? Probably not. What actually happens is they put it in all solicitations, and then it's on you to get it taken out. And it's been that way since 2016. So that's what that first line means, where they talk about 204, 7304. Now let's talk about what DFARS 7008 actually says. Here we are, finally. It's only 300 words. It's already taken us this long to get to it. Okay, so the title of provision 7008, compliance with safeguarding covered defense information controls, dated October of 2016, which is when the final rule came out that made it. First paragraph, definitions. These contract clauses will always have definitions up front. Lawyers don't go anywhere without their definitions. And like you said before, the little Russian nesting doll effect. They say the definitions of all these relevant terms, covered defense information, controlled technical information, cyber incident, technical information, those are defined in 7012. So they're separate things, and 7008 makes you aware of 7012, but they really do go together. They don't go anywhere without each other. And the formal definitions are in the clause. This is making you aware that the clause exists. We'll dive into the definitions in the next episode when we talk about 7012 in the future. But just know, anytime you're going to look up a clause or solicitation, it's going to start with the definitions up front. And if you hear a term and you don't know what the definition is, there's a good chance that it's going to be defined in these regulations rather than somewhere else. You can always use those as the authoritative source for the definitions. It goes on to say, the security requirements required by Contract Clause 252-204-7012 shall be implemented for all covered defense information on all covered contractor information systems that support the performance of this contract, period. It's pretty clear cut. These requirements apply to your systems that process our data as prescribed in this clause that we are making you very aware of, right? That's all this provision is doing. They go on to say, for covered contractor information systems that are not part of an information technology service or system operated on behalf of the government, meaning the government is not acquiring IT from you. You're not a service provider to the government. You're not running a data center for them. You're not running a cloud app for them. You're a contractor receiving the data incidental to making a weapon system, making a missile, whatever it is that you do. You're not operating it on behalf of them. Then the following things apply to you. By submission of this offer, by bidding on this offer, the offerer represents that it will implement the security requirements in NIST SP 800-171 that are in effect at the time the solicitation is issued or authorized by the contracting officer no later than December 31st, 2017. That's the gotcha, folks. By accepting the terms of this offer, by submitting your bid, you are attesting to the government that you will implement these requirements. This is the self-attestation problem that eventually led to the entirety of the CMMC program, because people were accepting the terms of this solicitation provision. They were attesting to complying with DFARS 7012. And as we have found out, that work didn't get done. Bad stuff happened. Government got pissed. So they came up with a program to prove that you are doing what you're saying you're doing by accepting the terms of 7008 in addition to DFARS 7012. They go on to say, if the offerer proposes to vary from any of the security requirements specified in NIST SP 800-171, then the offerer shall submit to the contracting officer for consideration by the DoD Chief Information Officer a written explanation of two things: why a particular security requirement is not applicable to them, and how an alternative but equally effective security measure is used to compensate for the inability to satisfy a particular requirement and achieve equivalent protection. So we're making you aware that by bidding on this work, you are going to implement these requirements. And if you have a problem with one or more of those requirements, this is how you negotiate with us to either make it straight up not applicable as a part of our agreement in this contract, or your proposed alternative that is just as good as what our requirement would be, which will be locked in the terms of the contract. They go on to say an authorized representative of the DoD CIO will adjudicate offer requests to vary from NIST SP 800-171 requirements in writing prior to contract award, right? We're agreeing before this award executes what the terms of protecting our data are going to be. Any accepted variance from NIST SP 800-171 shall be incorporated into the resulting contract. This is why I've always said CMMC is showing up to verify the baseline that you negotiated in the terms of your contract. If you are able to make the case that 17 of these requirements don't apply to you, then the CMMC assessor is going to verify that the rest of the requirements apply to you. They don't get to dictate what applies to you, but it's also not the time to negotiate the terms of the contract that you have already agreed to a year later, whenever your CMMC assessor shows up, or 6 months later, or whenever the assessors show up, right? That's not what the CMMC function is doing. They're there to prove that you have implemented the baseline that you have agreed to that was incorporated into the resulting contract itself. And that all started with DFARS 7008, not with CMMC.
It's kind of weird when you look at this and you try to relate it to other things that, kind of apply to this. You know how we often talk about how like 853 is the sole source, like the absolute start of different baselines, different guidelines, different guidance guidance documents, stuff like that, 171, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of like 7008's that for every single one of the clauses, because if you look at it, all of the controls map back to 7008. If you look at any of these guidance documents that are below 53, all of them obviously map back there. And all we're seeing here is just a repeat of the same story kind of we've been saying for now 3 years on this show.
Yeah, DFARS 7019 and 7020, as we'll talk about in the future, that came out 4 years after 7008 and 7012. They say you got to calculate scores from your self-assessment against 171. Well, what required you to implement 171? These clauses and solicitations, right? 7020 says you got to make your system available for DIBCAC to come in and conduct an assessment to prove that you have implemented your requirements. Who said you had to implement the requirements? 7008 and 7012 did, right? And then afterwards, you get to CMMC with 7021, so on and so forth. So it all cascades from 7008 and 7012. Now, back to, just to wrap up here, back to the importance of reading the rule text and not just the regulatory text. There are explanations in the rules, even in 2016, that are still valid. So there were people who were like, can you explain this process of negotiating to vary from this baseline? And they go, sure, we can. They go, 7008 exists to make you aware of your requirements, blah, blah, blah. If you want to vary, you have to propose some sort of compensating control, blah, blah, blah. You have to have a written explanation to your contract officer, blah, 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 blah. And then they say the contracting officer will then take your variance request and they will refer it to the DoD CIO for adjudication. As of this conversation, that is Katie Arrington herself. So she is ultimately responsible for approving your waiver and or alternative solution to the requirements in 800-171. There's a bit of an irony there if you guys remember the story of CMMC 1.0. Anyways, the DoD CIO, according to the rule, is responsible for ensuring consistent adjudication of proposed non-applicable or alternative security measures. So ultimately, it's her call. Then they say if the DoD CIO needs additional information, a request is made to the contracting officer. You see a pattern here? Everything orbits around the contracting officer because you're on a contract with the DoD and you interface with their contract workforce. You are not negotiating with CMMC assessors. You're negotiating with the contract officer. They say responses are then returned to the contracting officer, who in turn advises the contractor of the decision. They say that the time frame for response by the DoD is typically within 5 business days. So very reasonable. I've been waiting on stuff to ship to my house longer than 5 business days. And maybe one of the most important lines out of the entire rule in 2016, the basis for determining if an alternative to a security requirement is acceptable is whether the alternative is equally effective. The basis for determining a security requirement is not applicable is whether the basis or condition for the requirement is absent, right? Just because you can't afford to meet a requirement does not mean that it is not applicable to you. Just because you are a small company does not mean that the requirement is not applicable to you. The basis for the requirement needs to not exist for it to be not applicable. For instance, Wi-Fi security requirements don't apply if you don't have Wi-Fi, right? You don't have to go buy Wi-Fi stuff and implement a Wi-Fi network because the requirements say you have to secure Wi-Fi. It doesn't work that way. If you have the basis for the requirements, then you must implement them. But that's really the only trigger for making sure that they are not applicable to your environment. Personally, in my opinion, if I were advising people, I would say if there are clear-cut reasons where a control is not applicable to you, we don't have Wi-Fi, I would go through this process of getting an adjudication from the DoD CIO rather than negotiating non-applicability with the CMMC assessors. There are cases where you can do that, but that's a little variable. Here, if the DoD CIO says, nope, not applicable, that's it. That's the end of the story. It goes right into your documentation. CMMC assessor, they don't have a leg to stand on. DIBCAC, they don't have a leg to stand on. They've said it's not applicable. That is the ultimate way to have a control completely X'd out of your scoping.
But it just feels like what we've seen, Jacob, is that more of the arguments that are being made about something being not applicable is not necessarily something not applicable, right? It's them trying to justify the fact that they don't do this, so they don't need that, and they don't need to implement the control, and that's not the case. It's just a gross misunderstanding of what's going on in a lot of probably the traffic that's taking place.
Now, do you have to do it this way? No, you can get, ticky-tacky back and forth with your assessors. I personally think that's more risky. If the DoD CIO says it's not applicable, that's it.
It's always, in assessments, it's always something has to be on paper, either the proof that the control is in place or that you've implemented it right, or proof that you don't have to do it. There's no other way to beat around the bush.
And if you have convinced yourself, or your adventurous IT and security team have convinced themselves that we have implemented an equally effective security control, so we're not going to do XYZ in 800-171, and you did not get that approved by the DoD CIO, strap in, because that ain't going to count. You're going to get assessed against what the requirement is because it didn't get adjudicated by the boss lady. So make sure you read 7008. It's making you aware of, if you got a problem, this is how you negotiate with us. And once that negotiation is done, it's part of the contract. So last little detail here, everybody's favorite topic. Let's talk about cost. So they say in the rule regarding 7008, 7012, there is no funding appropriation attached to compliance with the rule, so it is not feasible to create a program for compliance or a one-time subsidy related to the new security requirements associated with the rule. There is no funding appropriation in 2016. There is no funding appropriation in 2013, as we'll talk about in the 7012 episode. There is no funding appropriation in 2020. There is no funding appropriation in 2024 and beyond, right? Because your rate as a contractor is supposed to be paying for the things that you need to implement. They go on to say, however, the costs associated with compliance are allowable under the contract and should be considered in proposals on solicitations, including 7008 provision and the 7012 clause when covered defense information is present. The final rule is amended to require the security requirements be in place only when covered defense information is marked or identified in the contract, which, famous last words here, should cut down significantly on the number of contractors that mistakenly assumed they were required to comply. It didn't do that. It didn't do that. However, the point
didn't
here
age well. That comment
didn't age well. Aged like milk, as they say. But the point here is they're saying 7008 is making you aware of what's going on. You're submitting a bid with a rate to comply with these requirements. There's no extra funding appropriation here. So make sure that you take into consideration what DFARS 7012 will require of you, what SP 800-171 will require of you, and then we got a deal. We got a deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how it's supposed to work in terms of making you aware of what's going on. And that's how they answer questions about what about increased cost? What about variances? What about small business exceptions? What about impacts? What about all that stuff? They're like, we made it very clear to you that if you want to bid on this work, this is what comes with the work. End of story. Now, it's not necessarily that simple in terms of how it all played out. In the next episode of the show, we'll go into what DFARS 7012 says, because all of this stuff in 7008 is just really making you aware that you need to comply with the terms of 7012. But we'll get into that next time. Everything starts with DFARS 7008. If you're a defense contractor and you're waiting on CMMC to implement your requirements, you've made a terrible mistake, because 7008, 7012 are already in your contracts. That's the origin of this argument, where people go, you already should have been doing it. Starts right here with the 309 words in DFARS 7008 that have been unchanged since October of 2016. But we'll talk about what that means in terms of 7012 and beyond in the next set of episodes. And that's what we'll talk about starting next week.
Thanks for watching. See you next week.